at
Yeah,
the end if I go really fast.
yeah. And the preamble here is so what we're going to present to you today. If you just go to the title slide.
Oops,
Sure.
sorry.
So what we're presenting today is very much a work in progress. So this is a joint effort between Rob and I. Rob, at this stage in the development of our long-term strategic vision, Rob's very much leading the thinking behind it, and I've been working very closely with him in how we can articulate it, because with this, it's a fundraising tool, right? So by no stretch are we presenting this to the board as a finished product. It's something to promote discussion, invite internal review. This is the first in a series of interactive internal review sessions. It is something that we spoke about at the beginning of the year, and we're now at a point where it's logical to share and invite that feedback. So in a nutshell, we're looking at, again, draft long-term 25+ year strategic vision. If I wanted to summarize the philosophy of that vision, it would be to fill in the gaps in conservation in the Annamite Mountains, supporting the underdogs, so the species that are being neglected and that face global extinction without additional intervention, we hope by the Saola Foundation, directly through conservation action, and then also indirectly by influencing and empowering the partners who we work with on the ground. And the headline being, how can we, this vision is really all about, at its core, how can we maximize the gains of our conservation investment? And with that, I'll hand over to Rob. Thanks.
Oops.
Done.
Oops. Okay, so to get into what Lorraine was just talking about, so our sort of our biodiversity conservation scope, as Lorraine mentioned, really kind of should be these species facing imminent global extinction, and we're not just talking about birds and large mammals, but any form of life, biodiversity, and it's sort of reiterating again, it's these sort of gaps in conservation. It's trying to find those gaps, so not kind of repeating what other people are doing, but filling gaps, creating a better, more essentially a more holistic conservation landscape, right? Sort of geographic scope, as our name suggests, is really the whole of the Annamite Mountains, but it's not really just the mountains. It's sort of the bioregion created by those mountains. So it's, it also includes lowlands. That sort of geographical scope is sort of represented by the sort of green area on the map. We've been focused essentially only on Laos so far, but a majority of the sort of the Annamite bioregion is in Vietnam. And when you sort of think about it, biodiversity is not uniformly distributed. There are hotspots, and most of those hotspots are actually in Vietnam, not in Laos. And so, there's basically more biodiversity richness in Vietnam than there is in Laos. And there are also more threats in Vietnam than there are in Laos. So that sort of culminates in there really being more of these species facing global extinction in Vietnam, more gaps in Vietnam. And then, so looking from this sort of, 25-year long-term vision, Vietnam is theoretically way more important than Lao to sort of fulfilling that vision. You know, Vietnam has potential for much more conservation gain than Lao does. Um, so, sorry, what my oh wait a bit, it is working. Yep. Okay. So to sort of quickly look at the basically the threats the primary threats on the ground that are causing these species, um, to face extinction. Um, basically, basically harvesting that's not unregulated or even regulated in some cases, but the bottom line is there's no management of it, there's no sense to it, there's no consideration of the impacts on biodiversity. The number one things that is things like hunting, timber logging, fishing. It comes in so many different forms, but the form isn't so important. What's really important is the economics of it. Um, you know, and whether it's sort of sanctioned by the government or not. Um, another major factor in extinction of species is going to be, or likely to be, just structural habitat degradation. And that affects not particularly large mammals and birds. There's perhaps only one species of bird that it's really clearly part of the problem for, but it's likely to be a problem from other forms of biodiversity, especially the types of biodiversity that people don't think about a lot. Um, Outright habitat loss, again, not a big issue for most birds or large mammals, even though everybody talks about habitat loss being a big issue for large mammals and birds. It's not, but it is likely to be an issue for um, other forms of biodiversity. And lastly, climate change, which we know very little about, but the signs that we're seeing in the Annamites suggest that, just like everywhere else, climate change is going to be a wrecking ball. And you know, interacting with all of these other threats could be a major problem for a lot of biodiversity. Um, yeah, so what are the gaps? So, why are these threats a problem? Why are they there in the first place, basically? Um, you know, these threats essentially result in, many, I mean, we know some of them already, but most of the species that are threatened with extinction are cryptic, they're overlooked, ignored. People are just not focusing on them. They don't know about them. And yeah, and as a result, they're just going to disappear. Um, that's partly because, by and large, current conservation focuses on, popular, charismatic species, tends to be large mammals more than anything else. Um, we also have, because of this, all of this culminating together, lots of knowledge gaps. Nobody's really focused, other than, let's say, me, on these intra-Annamite hotspots of biodiversity. How is biodiversity distributed in Annamites? We have ideas, but there's not very much. I mean, in 1999, myself and colleagues put together an analysis, and since then, and pretty much conservation has been based on that 1999 report and review for the last, 24 plus years. Not much has changed. We knew a little bit then. We don't really know much more since then. There's just, another big part of the problem is there's just, low, poor capacity to actually deliver on effective conservation strategies for these species facing imminent extinction. I mean, it's a struggle even um, as we're finding, right, for a species like Saola, for species that are less at risk, yes, it's not too hard. The minimum, the sort of trickle of conservation is fine for things like red shank duke. I mean, it's critically endangered, but it's actually not really facing extinction anytime soon. And there's a large number of species out there that will get by with the trickle of conservation effort that there is, but there needs to be a lot more for many other species. Um, and then, but part of the problem isn't particularly Annamite folks. Part of the problem is just global problems, So as we're finding with solar conservation, a global inequity in resource allocation. Why is it so difficult to fund Saola, a species on the brink of extinction, when it's so easy to fund, let's say conservation work in the US or certain iconic species like tigers and elephants? There's inequality there. Um, and then another global problem is just the difficulty of making objective decisions to inform conservation interventions. When you drill down to it, there really isn't much out there to sort of help you. How do you sort of prioritize, you know, and it's the same, for funders, for donors. Do they have tools? Not really. So, these are sort of the problems. Um, so this, let's say, moving on to how we might think of of the vision. So this is sort of a representation of the Annamites today. It's still, forests have been fragmented, but there's still a big green area out there. There's still a lot of biodiversity left in the Annamites. Um, the colored dots essentially represent, all this sort of difficult to put a name on biodiversity, the insects, the plants, the fungi, everything else, right? Which is, incredibly rich. So if you compare that with, another area of the world, those number of dots, if you compared it with the UK, for example, right, there might be a single dot on there to represent, the full amount of UK biodiversity compared with the Annamites. The Annamites is very rich. The species, in brackets are the species which I would predict will be extirpated from the Annamites before conservation turns a corner and actually starts getting better. So, and the species that are underlined are the sort of endemics, and extirpation for them means extinction. So that's probably coral bill ground cuckoo, Saola, large antler muntjac, a Bullicamp leaf monkey, a new species that we put, that's out in Laos. Some other things, elephants are very likely going to disappear from the Annamites before things turn around. Gower, bears also have a pretty high chance of disappearing from the Annamites. These are the two potential futures that I see for the Annamites. On the left, you have what I see is the current trajectory. So if you notice those endemics, right, coral bill ground cuckoo, Saola, large antler muntjac, Bullicamp leaf monkey, they're headed for extinction, and so is a great amount of the other biodiversity. All of those missing coloured dots. What isn't going to be absent though from the future of the Annamite Mountains? So this is say, let's say 50, 100 years time, right? This is what the Annamites will look like in 50 to 100 years time if we don't get involved. So yes, Gower will probably be extirpated, and bears will probably be extirpated, and tigers are already extirpated from the Annamite Mountains. But in 100 years' time, once conservation turns the corner, people will bring those things back. So, I'm not worried at all about bears, elephants, tigers, Gower. They'll be taken care of. They might disappear from the Annamites. 100 years' time, somebody will bring them back. What I'm worried about is what can't be brought back, which I would say is unrecoverable biodiversity. And that's what I think, we can focus on, and that's our vision for the Annamites. So we're in this sort of planning phase, right, of developing the vision and how that looks in terms of strategy. There's these open standards which are widely used among conservation practitioners. Um, you know, we are basically trying to fit everything we do into these open standards, just because that makes sense to communicate with everybody else. It's also, a very useful tool, just internally as well, to help everybody get on the same page. When you think about it for Saola, we're already, we've planned, we've implemented, and we're, already sort of analyzing and adapting the strategy for Saola. It's meant to be kind of circular, always adapting, and then coming back, planning again, implementing, etc., etc. So that's the sort of path, or that's the approach we're taking. For the things beyond Saola, we're mainly, sort of at the that sort of first stage, assessing, thinking about planning, etc., etc. But just to say, that's the sort of process that we're in. So our conservation, yeah, so conservation targets, that's a specific term for that, for that planning process, right? And as it probably, as the name suggests, those are the sort of, when you drill down to it, those are the targets that you focused on. And for us, those targets are essentially, these species facing imminent global extinction. And how do we go about identifying and prioritizing those? Well, it's thinking about, this conservation gain, which species are going to give us that conservation gain, identifying the gaps, right? What are the gaps that we could easily fill to save those species from extinction? Can we actually identify the species themselves? If we can't identify themselves right now, then we need to do something about that. So the priority obviously is things that we could immediately latch onto. Capitalizing on opportunities. Which species, which conservation, which species facing extinction are out there? Can we see? We already know about, and there's an opportunity to go for them. And then it's also about creating pathways towards opportunities. We maybe know that there's a conservation target, a species facing extinction. We really can't see how we can do it right now. So it's maybe then creating that sort of pathway towards that species. So it wouldn't be a conservation target right then, but in our vision, we create a pathway. We reach that conservation target sometime in the future. A reality, and then reality check. This is all about reality. It's it's what we can do and what we can't do, right? So a lot of that, a big part of that is part of this problem, part of this process of identifying conservation targets. So the conservation targets that actually, realistically within our reach at the present time, we we've already got Saola, a flagship for the Annamites. Um, I'm not giving up hope on Saola, but we always have known there is a possibility that Saola, we might not be able to save Saola. My guess is that, you know, probably sometime next year we'll get an answer to that. And so hopefully that's a positive answer. Great. We move on with Saola, but if it's a negative, we're going to have to quickly pivot. And so for that reason, it probably makes sense to start thinking about and start promoting the fact that, we're not just an organization about saving Saola. We do want to do other things. We are capable of doing other things. And so I think I'm not sure how much everybody's aware, but there's this new species of leaf monkey in Bullicam soy. It's got a lot of synergy with what we're doing for Saola. It's in the same province, it's dealing with the same local government. Um, um, it's not exactly in the same search areas for Saola, but they're basically adjacent, right? So it's again it's this sort of opportunities and synergies. So it makes sense, right, to tag that on as a potential second conservation target to head towards. Second on the list, large antler muntjac, a species which it's probably after Saola the next closest species, or facing imminent global extinction of large identifiable mammals, at least in the Annamites. It's also, there's a well, there are several potential sites where we could look at for the large antler muntjac. One of those sites would potentially bring a lot of gain. Consegna Noir, it's likely to be a site for many other of these, basically at present hard to identify species facing global extinction. We haven't really done anything yet with the muntjac. It's still in the thinking process, but again, from the point of view of opportunities and realism, these are the three that make the most sense where we are now. I mean, another point to make is that it would be hard, if we knew a certain species of fly was about to go extinct, it would be incredibly difficult, right, to fund that. It wouldn't make much sense trying to make that a conservation target right now. Because of this global inequality in the way funding and resource allocation is, we've got more chance with large mammals, especially a primate that's a new species, right? It's just an easier sell, right? And then, going forward, we would be always, looking for, sort of possibilities to bring, additional species facing imminent global extinction in on the fold. I was going to say, Lorraine, just in case, if I'm going over time, just let me know, right?
You're good, Rob.
Okay. So, you know, sorry. So now thinking about, kind of what are the sort of steps we need to take to achieve that vision. Sort of, filling the gaps, finding the problems, finding these species, maximizing that conservation gain. Oops, sorry. Um, I kind of see I kind of see, oops, sorry. Actually, let's do it this way. I kind of see, sort of four cornerstones to that, to implementing sort of implementing what we need to do to sort of get to that vision. I mean, I think, I'm very sure, different people would look at this differently and maybe, sort of think about it in a different way. So this is sort of the way I've been thinking about it, but by no means is necessarily the way everybody else would think about it, or even the way, in future we might present it. Um, and these, so also, there's a lot of overlap between, these, let's say, cornerstones, and to some extent they sort of maybe nested within each other. But to me, they're just sort of discrete um, aspects that sort of make some sense to sort of understanding, what we can do. Um, so the first one on the list is the sort of developing and using prioritization tools. And this goes back to this sort of idea that, essentially at a global level, it's actually very difficult to find tools out there to actually um, think about how to make good decisions, objective decisions, right? Um, and so, it sort of comes down to a need really to develop a metric, an objective metric, right, that measures biodiversity value, in the way so that then you could say, what's the value of saving Saola versus the value of saving elephants? I mean, I don't want to get into the concept now. It's complex, but I think there are ways to do it. There are ways out there, and it could make a big deal of difference. Um, and that boils into, sort of prioritization of species, but also a way, of even thinking on the ground, which area should be we working in? Should be we working in the area there, or the other one over there? It's how to sort of objectively make these decisions. And then another real part of it is, if you're going to calculate gain, you need to have something you can believe in, right? Something that's going to give you objective, measurable results. So it's all really tied into sort of, yeah, the sort of need to really believe in something and have an objective way of doing that. Um, our actions for the next few years, really, I think, it's not something we could easily do. We can, I mean, so I've been, sort of developing my own system and using it for my own purposes for the last, well, 30 years essentially. So internally we could use a system, but really, if to be able to communicate to people, it would be much better to have a system out there, that's more widely recognizable and people understand. And to do that, it's not something we can just do off the bat. It's a question of, forming these sort of strategic partnerships with people who also believe there's a need for these tools. And we know that that's true. ASAP definitely would like to see something like this happen. So, the early stages are really just, forming these sort of partnerships and figuring out, okay, how are we going to do it? How are we going to raise the funds, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the second of these sort of cornerstones that I see is, undertaking and steering proactive applied conservation research. And this is not um, not sort of wishy-washy academic science, not something that maybe or maybe not will be used, but really sort of research that can be used essentially in real time to really make a difference. Um, addressing, for example, those sort of knowledge gaps, understanding the distribution, and biodiversity, um, it could involve many things, the climate, understanding climate better. It's also, but also if you developing these sort of conservation metrics, at some point you need sort of validation of what you're doing, right? It can't be just theoretical. You want to be able to show people that it really means something. And then, there's just the objective measurement of conservation outcomes, right? So being able to confidently show that what you said you would do is actually there. Again, that there's uh, people always talk about monitoring and measuring of conservation outcomes, but there isn't actually that much out there that's very useful that you can actually believe in. A lot of it's theoretical, academic, and I would say a lot of conservation practitioners aren't somewhat skeptical of some of this stuff. So better ways of doing that. Again, for the next few years, it's really more about forming, these partnerships with people who really value the idea of doing that. Um, but it also ties into some of the other actions we hopefully will be taking over the next few years, which I'll come to below. Um, the third cornerstone, you know, developing, the conservation capacity needed to pull off, effective conservation in the Annamites. A large part of that are the sort of human resource capacity. There's a great deal of improvement that could be made there. As we found with the Saola project program, there weren't the human resources in Lao to pull off saving Saola, right? There wasn't an existing Lao scent detection dog team. There wasn't an existing animal tracking team. Um, you know, even finding sort of a skilled field team, wasn't, even if we tried to steal everybody away from all the other conservation organizations in Laos, we would have still been struggling to implement a field project for Saola. Um, so, particularly for the next few years, we've got a heavy focus on that, continuing development of that team that we've already started. Um, Developing, this idea for a research and conservation center of excellence, which potentially fulfills multiple functions. But if we think of it perhaps most centrally, as a base of operations for the Saola Foundation, which, then links back to things like, um, you know, this sort of applied conservation research, right? That, you need something like that to work out of, to get things like that going. Um, um, another avenue, that ties in with that research and conservation center, but in just in general, in terms of capacity development, is trying to strike up strategic partnerships with universities and other academic institutions in Laos and more internationally, to start to forge better preparation, right, for future Lao conservationists. Um, so the fourth,
Got about
fourth,
got another about 2 or 3 minutes, Rob.
okay. So yeah, the last cornerstone is actually, the direct conservation interventions. A lot of the above, you could think of, you could potentially think of as, you know, sitting behind a desk and doing it, but we have to get our hands dirty as well, right? We've got to practice what we preach, you know, and that, sort of comes back to our, the conservation targets we've got at the moment, right? And actually doing things on the ground in particular, towards saving those. For Saola, we at the moment focused in this area in Bully Campsite. As I say, probably sometime next year we'll sort of get an answer. And if that answer is positive, it means we're probably looking sort of expanding out into other areas of Lao for Saola. Um, starting to think about future reintroduction, which itself, starts to bring in this idea that, we have to start thinking of Vietnam. Um, there's this new leaf monkey, as I say, works very synergistically with what we're doing with Saola already. It's sort of adjacent areas, we can, but there's obviously the funding constraints, so we have to see where things go. But that works very well with what we're already doing. There's a site, Conseg Namar, actually in the province south of Bully Sai. It would be the ideal site to think about a program centered on large antler muntjac. It would also, be an ideal site for this research and conservation center. If feasible, hopefully we can start looking into that, sometime, end of this year through next year. And then there's other sites, potentially out there in Lao, that sort of tie in strategically and opportunistically, with what we're doing for Saola, potentially for these other species. And then, there's always, as we say, looking for these opportunities. Vietnam is really important for the vision. We've got nothing at the moment, but let's look for opportunities. So a month or so ago, we were asked to provide input into actually a USAID project that's going to pump, I think, $30 million into Vietnam. We don't know if anything will come of that, but if it does, it's an opportunity, right? So let's see what happens. Yeah. Oh, so over to Lorraine. Sorry.
That's awesome. Thank you, Rob. I'm going to wrap up quite quickly now because I know Frank can stay on till 2, so maybe give him an opportunity to voice any feedback before he has to head off. Just a quick apologies. All the slide errors you saw were down to me, so I did the last minute development of this. Everything that Rob's just presented, it's been an intense development over the last couple of weeks, but also just an unbelievable amount of work over the last 6 months by Rob. There's a lot of really deep conceptual materials behind what Rob's presented today, which would have just been far too overwhelming to include in this call, but important to note that they exist. Next steps, review, adapt within this conservation standards framework. Formation of a high-level think tank that can help us in strategy development, effective communications, identifying those opportunities, building our fundraising capacity. As you know, we're now on the lookout for a skilled fundraising and communications director, and fingers tightly crossed, if we find the right person, it could really significantly build the capacity of our already fantastic team. We need to build confidence in stakeholders that we really can be that key player in Annamite Mountains conservation, and especially donors, right? So obviously this is a strategy to effect long-term change and improvement in Annamite Mountains conservation, but today and in the near-term future, this strategy is a tool to attract investment. So put those googly eyes there. It's a reference to this film. We can't be everything everywhere all at once. It's not realistic. Some components are going to attract funding, other components aren't. Having multiple components to use as tools for fundraising, I hope will optimize our chances to build resilience within the foundation. Really, we're looking for that intersection, right, between what we want as conservationists and what funders want to fulfill their needs to demonstrate impact. How can we influence our funders rather than the other way around, right? So I hope everybody enjoyed that today. And Rob, if you could unshare your screen, and then, yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts from the board. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Well, given I have to drop off in a few minutes, and I apologize for that. Some unforeseen
No worries.
things popped up as it is, these things tend to do. Thanks very much for that, Rob, and I very much appreciate the depth of thought that's gone into the material you presented. I think moving on from the notion of the Saola as the kind of the unicorn of the foundation, putting all our efforts into trying to find it and moving it towards being more of a kind of metaphor for what it is that we're trying to achieve at a larger scale, and that it brings in all these other species underneath it, even if the geographical locations are slightly different. I think that's absolutely a masterstroke. That's exactly the way it will be, that people will appreciate why it is that Saola are so important, but also that the landscape in which it lives is of substantial value for other species too. I think the idea of picking a set of conservation targets that will resonate with donors is a very important thing, and also recognizing that what you do to support the conservation of those species will benefit a whole range of other things in those same areas. That's also, I think, a very sensible and strategic way to go about planning things. I think there is a danger you could overthink this. I think that when it boils down to it, what the main threats are that apply to the species you've identified and the places you've identified that they occur. Just pile in there and figure out how we manage those threats. That would be my kind of short-term recommendation about moving stuff forward in an expeditious fashion. I think the really, really important message here, one that I've been trying to emphasize with all my discussions with people in financing organizations, financial disclosures, governments, you cannot afford to hang around. You have a very limited time to act. You know pretty much what you have to do. Just pile in there and start. Just address the big threats that you know are being expressed in the places where you can do something about them. Get going and deliver some verified and measurable impacts on those threats quickly. And that's what will convince people that you're doing the right thing. I don't think you should spend any more time thinking that through. I think you should just get going and start that. I think if we want to be able to persuade donors to come along with us, then we can make the message much more simple and much more energizing, such that they are recognizing that what we're doing is something of great conservation value more widely. And I'd be very happy to help think about how the messages that we want to transmit to donors look in terms of the enormous substance of analytical material that you've generated there. I think particularly going into enormous amounts of detail about conservation planning, I don't think that'll get you a great deal further than just deciding these are the 4 threats that apply to these species in the different places we work. We're just going to go ahead and try and deal with them and build capacity to manage them and knowledge of how those threats are manifested and how we can deal with them as we go. And that's the way we'll end up with a success. I am concerned that opening up the door to working in Vietnam is suddenly appeared on the agenda. Perhaps it's something I just missed before. That seems like a huge extra step, for which if you like, the kind of marginal gain of investing in Vietnam compared to continuing acting in Laos is not clear to me, particularly given the range of actors who are already working in Vietnam. What we would bring in addition to that, not clear. It sounded as if from your analysis, Rob, that we'd be much better off just sort of upping sticks and moving straight to Vietnam, because that's where you generate your major conservation gains. But I'm sure that's not the intent. But you could misinterpret what you said as that. So I think we need to be absolutely clear about what it is that we're planning to do in terms of delivering outcomes that relate to these conservation goals, these conservation targets, and where it is we're planning to do them. I would suggest that our enormous strategic and technical advantage is in Laos, and that anything we would want to do in Vietnam would be starting from a fairly low point of capacity and knowledge and networking. I may be completely wrong in that, but that's the impression I have. So I think we do want to go through that in a bit more detail before making a strategic decision about that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Frank. Rob, do you have anything you want to respond before Frank has to go?
Uh, phew. Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you say, Frank. I mean, I think I've known for my whole career that if we're actually going to make a major difference in the Annamites, it's going to come in Vietnam. I would say we would be remiss to base ourselves. I mean, I will always be looking myself for an opportunity to make a difference in Vietnam. If Saola Foundation were to stay only in Laos, then I'm not very interested in staying only in Laos. Let's put it like that, right? I think we started from nothing in Vietnam. Essentially, I mean, we started from Laos with Laos was just easier to start because of because of sort of connections we have at the moment. I don't. Vietnam is more complicated. Yeah, it will be more difficult to start there. But that's not to say we couldn't start there. I mean, I don't know. I mean, just yeah, it's more complicated. It would require, like you say, Frank, considerably more thought. But at the end of the day, if we look back 25 years from now and said, oh, from two perspectives, we only stayed in Laos and didn't get into Vietnam, and look back and thought, my God, I feel guilty at everything that's been lost in Vietnam versus being in Vietnam and looking back and saying, well, yeah, it was sort of risky to make the move, but thank God we did. Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting
I'll just point.
race to Vietnam.
The
Yeah, well, that was the
counterfactual to
point.
that is,
Point.
sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
I was just in point. This is a 25-year plus vision, right? So there's
Right.
like there's no race to jump into Vietnam to hopefully settle some nerves there.
Okay, good.
Sorry, go
Well,
ahead, Frank.
I was going to say the counterfactual to your vision, Rob, is that you might find yourself in 25 years' time thinking, my goodness, I'm really glad we didn't pull out of Laos because we made a really big difference and lots of things have happened that were positive that we achieved.
Well,
I mean,
but
we didn't actually have any ability to influence the large scale results of conservation action in Vietnam, given what's happened in Vietnam in the interim. So I think either of those two scenarios are, from my perspective at least, equally likely.
Let me say, I'm not talking about pulling out of Laos. I never ever suggested pulling out of Laos.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm afraid I have to go, but Lorraine, maybe we can catch up again as a next step to pursue.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Apologies for having to rush off.
Thanks, Frank.
Take care.
Bye.
I'm sort of stepping in his chair. I'm just does anybody else have some comments, questions, feedback, anything at all?
Well, I'm trying to put my head around, as a layperson, let's say, how, first of all, I certainly do not believe they have 25 years to make a difference in this area or any area of the world, frankly, at this point. That's just reality. We can talk about long-term. I've done long-term plans, other kinds of things. I think we have to be realistic about where things are at now in terms of that. I wish it was 25 years. I wish we had sufficient protected areas that you could do intensive research on that would not be changing over time due to all the threats that have already been identified. So what I can't get my head around, I guess, at this point, beyond this, what we're doing with Saola, is how research and identification of species makes a difference in the next 10 years with actual conservation activities, protecting those species and those areas. Because it's nice to have the scientific information, which I know is being collected all different parts of the world, but what difference will that make if everything is gone, or not gone, but depleted so much that we have our information on extinct species, but they won't exist anymore, or the habit, or even worse, in some respects, is the habitats are so depleted that there's not adequate protected areas or whatever, or I'd even say not even protected, that we've seen as maybe a Western thing, a place where local communities are engaged enough to protect. That's what seems to be working around the world long term, is if people, we have that, we have the team, we have Oli, et cetera, with all that. And to me, the thing that's going to make a difference is what will we be able to do from a conservation perspective, not just a research and scientific perspective, even though I understand what you're saying, Rob, in terms of the need for that. But it won't matter if the base of it is not viable. And we have this viability question even now. I'm sure I haven't been to Laos yet, of course, but so I'm speaking from not being there. But I've been to enough places where you can see, you walk into an area. I've been enough places now, at least, where you can sense if a habitat, let's say, is to some extent, viable. I'm not, not technically, because there's a lot of factors that get involved. So I'd hate to be in a situation where we set up a conservation and research center and then everything around it is gone or depleted, and therefore it's irrelevant except a feel-good thing, to be blunt about it. So I don't see in terms of this circular thing, these processes, I don't see where the conservation implementation part is, that we either feed into somebody that we could work with and develop, and then we have some good teams already, or something else. Otherwise, we're researching or identifying in a vacuum, and there's no protection or local engagement to protect things or to feel that way.
I'm gonna respond if that's all right, Rob, but at least at first. So one of the things which Rob touched on, but we didn't get deep into, was kind of identifying a process of identifying the fundamental causes of the problems, the gaps, right? So not hunting and people setting snares, but what are the processes or the missing processes that are going on between, with government, with policies and civil societies and NGOs that allow for these problems to exist in the first place, rather than so I'm not sure if I'm saying that as well as Rob could, but direct conservation implementation, it's not just about clearing snares and arresting poachers. It's much higher level than that needs to take place. And in order to actually make those interventions at that level, then you have to identify what the problems are in the first place. So that's what I have to say about that. But Rob, I'll let you respond as well.
Okay. I mean, I'm not, like that, the fourth pillar, we have to implement on the ground as well, right? I mean, we can't solve this just by giving information to everybody else and suggesting to everybody else what's going to happen, right? We have to implement on the ground. We have to try and reverse the trends ourselves. Where we do that makes a big difference to the future, right? So yeah, I mean, any intervention, we have to have an analysis, a decision-making process, and as part of that, you have to believe that you can get a high probability of a positive outcome, right? And everything I've ever done, I go through a process to make sure that I am confident, with a high probability in the outcome that we're trying to get to. The riskiest thing I've ever contemplated is trying to save Saola, right? So my probability estimates on the outcome for Saola are probably the lowest I've ever looked at, in terms of, saying, yes, let's go ahead and do this. it matters a lot. So the way I look at conservation is if we just so I've been thinking about this concept in the last few days. There's two types of biodiversity loss happening. There's recoverable biodiversity loss happening, and there's irrecoverable biodiversity loss happening.
Right.
Most conservation is focused on recoverable biodiversity loss. In other words, it can get lost, but in 100 years' time, you can bring it back. What's the point in us spending money on recoverable biodiversity loss? If we set up a research and conservation center next to an area of forest that really adds no value, could be lost and replaced in 100 years' time, what's the point to me? To me, it's about finding where there's unrecoverable biodiversity loss going on, because there we can actually say we made a difference to the future. What we do now will affect the future. Nobody, it's not that somebody else could come along in the future and do what we just did. It's, we have a chance to do it now, and this is the only possible chance of doing that, which kind of, I think, gets to what you're saying. And
Yeah.
when we talk about conservation research, we're not on about anything that's not going to be useful. To me, it has to be useful to making sure that we are, let's say, crystal clear on what we're doing and crystal clear on the outcomes that we want and crystal clear as much as possible that we are achieving that reduction in irreplaceable biodiversity loss. Sorry. Hopefully that gets somewhere to answer that.
Right. I mean, it still begs the question. I understand
Susie,
what
I'll
you're
hand
saying.
over to
That's
you.
very
Oh, sorry.
interesting. It was just, to me, it's still the question of how we work with, or somebody works with, okay, take the leaf monkey, for example, that we know, at least we identified. It's all we have identified. How do we work with the local communities or whatever for that protection? So it's already identified. We can identify the threats, but it's going to be, we can sort of, I don't think it's rocket science to know some of the threats, frankly.
Well, yeah,
So,
we know what the problems are. We don't. I mean, none of this research is about understanding the threats to the leaf monkey, right? We don't need to do it. We don't need to do any research. The only research we need to do for the leaf monkey is we need to know roughly the numbers of individual animals in the different pockets of cost. I already know that, right? I already know exactly what we need to know. We basically don't need to do very much. Local communities, yes, but the problem in a country like Laos is that the government controls everything. Local communities have almost zero say in anything. So you can say that the local communities are the key to everything. In Laos, they're not, because the government controls everything. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Susie, go ahead.
Oh, well, what Rob just said actually changes some of what I was going to say. Look, thank you so much for the presentation, because I haven't sort of been up to speed with all of the strategy stuff, and seeing it like that. I'm really pleased to see a plan for the next few years and it broadening out, because I think that, I've always been very nervous, what if things don't work with the Saola, that side of things. And I think it gives confidence. I would say this is a minor point really, but it does get more confusing with communications and stuff. So obviously you do need clever communications around that, because, when I worked with rhinos, it worked because it was very simple messaging. It's very clear. And if you're called save the rhino, but then you're trying to save other species, then it's very hard. And we call the Saola Foundation, that again, that's just a communications thing. I'm not saying. I do think some donors will prefer, one type of thing as in a very clear single species, and others will prefer broadening out. So I think it's a strength though. So I was going to talk about communities, but you've obviously just answered that, Rob. I guess what I would say though is somehow we've got to communicate why we're not talking about communities as much then, if that's not a clear target, because in every conservation program and every donor that I work with, communities is at the heart of it. And so it's a big, so that was one of my first questions. And so if it's not a target, we almost need to explain why, and if other partners are working with them, or just I suppose that's just more of around that. I was going to say that so in my organization at Saola, I'm going out to a workshop in November, and it's bringing together community leaders from all over the world to try and bring a framework around how do we develop community leadership about conservation. So I was going to say we could share this with you. I can still share it with you, but obviously it doesn't sound like it's quite as relevant. But I would say, again, just thinking about that communication, so much of the work I've done in the past has been around the behavior change, the communities, the social science area. So I don't know how relevant that actually is, but I guess it's just recognizing that it's a big question that donors and people will be asking partners. If it's not so relevant in this, then I suppose it's just been clear. I also wanted to sort of say, like Lorraine, and so my role is evolving at Saola, and I am very much becoming the partnership manager at Saola, and that very much around that is about partnering with key organisations that need organisational development. And you're obviously talking about capacity development there, Rob. You might already have that fulfillment. I think you've got quite good partners already, but it's just to keep that in mind that some of those gaps. I know Saola is already very keen on Saola. Well, certainly Malcolm and a few people are very keen on Saola. So we've always struggled to get funding from Saola, but it might be through other means. And what that tends to be then is going for joint funding when it comes to capacity development. That could be technical, that could be organisational, that could be leadership, any of that side of stuff. But organisations like Saola are very much trying to justify what is our existence, what is our purpose. We're looking at being this UK organisation, what relevance should we really have working in Africa or Asia? And a lot of that is about partnering and trying to look at how we share capacity and share any of those skills. Now, Saola also has a research component to it. So it has IOZ, the Institute, and we partner with King's College University. So again, I'm just thinking of some of the things you mentioned there, Rob. If I can't sort of promise all these things, but I'm just saying it's something that we could certainly pursue as well. And those institutions have partnerships with institutions all over the world. So I don't know particularly about Lao. I've made a few notes basically for me to go and find out a bit more around. There's also sustainable financing, which I'll ask my team around that, because are there any other opportunities now that you're looking at a wider landscape, wider species? I hear what you say about tigers and elephants and all of that side of stuff. They do bring in funding, usually. That is the one advantage. I would also say though that from a biological aspect, it might be that we can lose them, but again, come back to that community side. Tolerance and the science around how much tolerance communities have around these species. So once they stop learning to live with a certain species, that tolerance level goes right down. So there's that tolerance for species, but human wildlife conflict is something that we do a lot of as well. I personally think the Vietnam focus is actually really strong, because again, I'm seeing a lot of funders and partners very interested in that cross-border. And actually that is a real strength, and that creates more opportunities as well. I don't know what capacity you have and whether that's a partnership in Vietnam or whether that's, I absolutely hear what Frank says. Vietnam is a very busy country in terms of the NGOs there. I'm sure you know better than I do, but my experience of Vietnam is it's very political within the NGO sector. So it depends, how you feel there. But I do think from a funding, actually, I can really see the pros there. So I've made a few notes of a few things for me to try and go and find out about. But yeah, thank you very much. It was really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. I just wanted to, so the community thing is I mean, it's a crucial issue, right? Like you mentioned, but just for, from an on the ground conservation, achieving what we want to, it's just that from everything I've seen, there's it's probably, maybe the least important aspect, even though, I mean, it's the same, right? Every single grant we've in the last few months, we've had to explain how there's that sort of community component. So I think we're all on the same page. We need to develop what that is. It's just, the actual reality on the ground when you're working in Lao, basically everything's dictated by the government, including sort of what the communities do, so it's like, well, we're actually what conservation gain we can get out of the communities really is dictated by what the government's going to tell the communities they can and can't do, so it's it's that sort of
Hey, Lorraine, I have about 10 minutes of, is it okay if I? So, thank you. I know that there's a lot of work that has gone into that, and I really appreciate the thought, and I echo many of the same things that others have said. Lorraine, at the beginning, you said this was a fundraising, sort of piece as opposed to, so I'm not here to question the science and to all of that. But I had some feedback. One is, still most people in the world have never heard of the Annamites. And if I were to give some feedback, I would say, is it possible to somehow, is there something anywhere that sort of shows just how important the Annamites are compared to other places in the world? The level of biodiversity compared to other places in the world, because if I'm a funder and I only have money to put in one place, why am I picking the Annamites over the Amazon, which is on fire? And everyone knows the Amazon, right? I mean, they even have a company named after them that delivers things to your house. So, is it possible to talk more about the importance of the Annamites and just how underrepresented they are in terms of conservation work that's happening there? And that's why we're focusing on that area. So that would be one. Rob, at one point when you were showing those circles with, the dots and everything, I'm sure you didn't mean this, but I was hearing it like at one point you were going, look, all of the stuff that's underlined, which was the large antler mudjack, the cuckoo, the Saola, it almost made it, you sounded like they're done. We have no hope on those. And then in your next slides, it sounded like you're like, oh, and we're going to focus on those. I'm sure that's not what you intended, but as you walked through, that's what I heard. And I'm going, wait a minute. Like you just said they were going extinct and now we're going to try to do something. So I heard that. I do think in terms of the Vietnam thing, I'm not here to question. I do think though, if you said, because at one point you're like, well, most of the important biodiversity in the Annamites is in in Vietnam. But we're doing all of our work in Laos. That's fine. I just think that there needs to be a little bit more of an explanation as to, well, why did we pick Laos? And whatever those reasons are, it was easier to get a foothold there. We had some strategic partnerships. It was easier to get a start, but in our long-term vision, we also see us working in Vietnam. I think somebody, with your saying how important Vietnam was biologically and then not doing the work there, I think it just needs some more explanation as to why just start in Laos. And then the last piece, and to me, I'm sitting here as a white guy in the United States talking about Laos, right? And a funder could easily go, who the hell are you, a white guy in Boise, Idaho, to be talking about Laos and who are you and why are you doing this? I think that you need to take the third strategy. You have built, when you showed that picture of all of the people who are working on the teams, to me, that's one of the biggest selling points, right? You've built this group of people, you have taught them skills, and they can now use those skills to do important work in the country. And they will eventually, if this keeps going, will become the conservation leaders of Laos. And it goes to the community part. And maybe the town of whatever or the village of whatever doesn't have as much impact. But in terms of community, you're building a community of people who now have technical expertise, who have a conservation ethic, who are going to go and become leaders in the conservation movement. And at the end of the day, we have to be able to tell funders, it's not going to be dependent on some white guy in Boise, Idaho doing this. It's going to be dependent on the people in Laos and Vietnam to carry on this work. And we're just helping them get a start. And we're so excited to see once those seeds are planted and they're growing, we can't wait to see what happens. And we are going to be the feeder. I mean, eventually some of those folks are going to leave us and go do other things that are conservation related. And how wonderful that our organization will have planted the seeds and sent people off to other organizations. I used to work for the Nature Conservancy earlier in my career, and somebody said, I think one of the most underrated accomplishments of the Nature Conservancy, because someone had done a survey, and it turns out that there were at least 400 other conservation organizations that were being led by someone who used to work at the Nature Conservancy and had gotten their start at the Nature Conservancy. And I mean, what a legacy that is. And so, you know, it seems, I mean, look at Ole. I mean, he's going to be the head of the national park system at one point in his life, you know, in Laos, and how cool that he got his start here. So I would play that up a lot.
Rob, do you have anything to respond? Did you want to clarify you're muted? Yeah.
No, it all sounds good. And I mean, I think quite a few of the recent grants, right, we have been trying to make a bigger emphasis of the team. And that also, you know, going back to the sort of the community aspect, I mean, we've been making a real effort to recruit team members, you know, from actual smaller communities, because in many ways, you know, that there's a bigger pool of potential conservation leaders in these small communities than there are in Vientiane, you know, because there's so, you know, the Lao population is basically in small communities, right, scattered throughout the country. And I think, you know, I mean, yeah, we've pulled some amazing people out of some of these small communities, and to me, they're yeah, as you're saying, Steve, these are the people that are going to make the difference to conservation in Laos in the future.
And Rob, you know, I've also been involved in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique for the last 16 or 17 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the guy who started it got to Mozambique and there was no capacity locally. I mean, he literally had to find kids in grade school and high school and start them that way. But now 98% of all the people who are running Gorongosa National Park are Mozambicans, and it's made such an important difference. And it's taken 17 years to get there, but you also said this was a 25-year plan. So 25 years is enough time to grow an entire, you know, culture of conservation in a place.
Yeah.
So we're gonna end the call in a few minutes. Ollie, I really hate to put you on the spot, but as the only Lao person in the room, we'd really love to hear from you. I know that you've got Danny, so and Ollie and I were discussing, you know, quite recently the next steps in terms of, you know, bringing, okay, this is the board review, but it's really critical now that we bring in the Lao team and the key players so that they can also, you know, give input in and develop ownership over this strategy. Ollie, do you have something to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, a little bit actually. Yeah, this is fantastic. I cannot imagine how much effort and knowledge to have it the first draft of the strategies. Thank you so much, Rob and Brian. I very much appreciate. I will need some time to understand more about the strategies. What the things top up in my head right now just about the concern creating the research and conservation center of excellence in Forum in Khun Sen Ông Ma. I'm thinking, should we consider like the new area? Probably, you know, we cannot do it that because we have lesson learned from Asian Arc, WCS. But anyway, we can discuss more about this. And I'm thinking it would be a good opportunity to have a Lao team to get involved, get familiar, and understand more about the strategies. Probably they will have some feedback, I think. Yeah, that's all from me.
Thanks, Ollie. And in an ideal world, that would have happened first before even getting to this point. The Lao team would have had, would have been doing this hand in hand. We've been, as always, running a really fast pace due to the urgent need of developing these tools for fundraising. So for sure, that's going to be our next priority over the coming months to bring the Lao team in. So thank you. So Steve, I'll hand over to you for wrap up.
Well, again, I appreciate, I think everybody on the board appreciates, I know they do, appreciates all the hard work that's gone into this and the thinking, the foresight to say, you know, yes, we're still got our fingers crossed for Saola, but that might not work. You know, no one's fault. It just, they might be gone already. Let's hope that's not the case. So, you know, and we applaud the efforts. I mean, and we recognize the fact that this is a bit of a race against time, you know, not only from a biological and an extinction crisis, but also, you know, a race against time to make sure that our funding keeps up with what we're trying to do. And so thank you for the pivot. Thank you for thinking in that way, because you know, I'm running an organization now, and I keep telling people we have to continue to evolve, because if you don't continue to evolve, you go extinct. And I am not a fan of extinction. And so thank you for evolving.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, goodbye, everybody. I'll circulate the recording. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
Thank you.
have a
Bye
good
bye.
weekend.
You too.